So now let's start and configure the shards that we're going to be using. Now I'm going to do this faster than the way I did the config servers because you generally know the process already. I'll also be using two terminals just so that we can make things more efficient. So let me just get it ready, and I'll SSH to both the sharding servers A and B for shard 1. Okay, so again, what I did with the config server is very similar to what I'm going to do with the sharding servers. I am going to be editing the file, and I will be changing the port for this server. So the port for shards on MongoDB is 27018. So 27018 would be the default port for MongoDB shards. I'll also need to configure replication and sharding. So for replication, again, I need to give it a replica set name, and let's give it the name shard1. Make it as easy to understand as possible. For sharding, I need to give it the cluster role shard server. Now again, a reminder that the cluster role is given. You have to use the name shard server. The replica set name is not given. So you can use whatever name you want. I can call it shard1, shard A, I can call it Jeffrey, whatever name I want to give to this particular replica set. So again, this is for shard1A. I will be doing the same for shard1B. So again, I'm going to change it from port 27017 to 27018. And then I will be editing the replication and sharding settings. So for replication, I will give it the same replica set name. So this will be shard1. And for sharding, I will give it the cluster role, and we will give it again the shard server cluster role. Similarly, we will need to restart the MongoDB service. And we will also need to check if everything is running appropriately. So you can see that it is running on port 27018. Now I can also do the same for shard B or 1B. And I can also see that it is running on port 27018. Now I also need to configure the replica set. Sorry, I forgot to specify the port. Now when configuring this replica set, you have to make sure that config server is no longer true, or you omit the config server portion. So when I set up my config servers, remember that it actually said config server true. Here, notice that there is no more config server true. Okay? So we have to set config server as not true or just omit it. Actually, this also won't run. I also noticed the mistake. You also need to configure the port correctly. So config servers run on 27019, while shard servers run on port 27018. So that was a mistake on my part, but this is again common mistakes that you may make. Okay? So you can also see I made another mistake, and that is the ID of the replica set. The ID of the replica set needs to match whatever I set in my config file. So the ID earlier was CSRS, and now I have to change the ID to shard1. So you can see it responded with OK. That means it should already be replicating. Similarly to what I said with the config servers, you can see that there are two secondaries for this replica set. Eventually, one of those secondaries will be promoted to primary. And also, eventually, they will successfully sync with one another. So don't be concerned. As long as you have one primary and one secondary, and it replied with an OK message, that means that everything is going fine. So again, I'm going to do the same with shard 2 and shard 3. So for shard 2, I'll be doing the same thing. And I will be showing this to you really completely, because I could fast forward this, but I just wanted to show you the things that you have to do very clearly, just so that you know what to do. So again, I'm going to change it to port 27018, and I will include the replica set name and the sharding cluster role. So for the replica set name, I'm going to call it shard2. For the cluster role, I'm going to call it the shard server. Take note that the number of spaces matter. This is a YAML file. So the number of spaces matter in the file. Make sure that you follow the 2-space standard. So again, 27018. And I am going to set up my replication and sharding components. So again, I just put 2 spaces, and then I'm going to call it replica set name shard2. For sharding, 2 spaces, and again, the cluster role is going to be shard server. I'm going to now restart the MongoDB service. And you can see it is now running on port, oh, it's not running on port 27018. That means I probably did something wrong. At least we can see what we need to do to debug that. Oops. So let's see what we can do to debug that. Oh. Sorry, I probably just took some time to reboot. But apparently I didn't do anything wrong. I may actually just cut off that part in the video, but we'll see. So you can see it's now running on port 27018. And again, we can do the same for the second member of the replica set. And again, we can check open ports. And you can see it is running on port 27018. Now we need to initialize the replica set. And again, the command to initialize is the same. So this is for shard2. And we are just going to rerun the command that I ran earlier to initialize the server or the replica set. Oh, sorry. Again, you notice I made a mistake with the ID. Make sure you have your parameters correct. And you can see now there is an OK message. That means that it should be replicating correctly. And I can check the replica status. You can see there is now a primary and secondary. It doesn't matter which one is primary and which one is secondary. Right? It really doesn't matter to you. And generally in real life, you would use the same server type for the replica and the primary. So again, which one is the replica and which one is the primary shouldn't really matter to you. However, if in the case that you should matter to you, if you have that specific use case, MongoDB does allow you to set up weights for each member of the replica set. But again, that's out of the scope of what we're going to talk about. And finally, I'm going to connect to shard 3. And again, the process is generally the same. Edit the config file, set the port, and of course, set replication and sharding. So I'm going to set replication and sharding. Replica set name to shard 3. Sharding to cluster role, shard server. Same thing goes with the second member of the replica set. The order with which you do this also does not matter. So again, we'll set up the replication set name. And we will call it shard 3. And for sharding, we will call the cluster role shard server. But this is actually given. Now we are going to restart the MongoDB service. And we can again check running ports, and you can see that it is running on port 27018. Same thing goes now for the first server. And again, we can check ss-ant, and you can see it is running on port 27018. Now again, finally, I will need to initialize the replica set. So again, port 27018, and I will be initializing this replica set. So this is shard 3. Notice I'm just copying the IP addresses. It's important to be organized when you do this. You should have all of your IP addresses ready. You can do it the way I'm doing it, which is having a separate text file, just so that we can make sure everything is running correctly. And you can double check the command before you paste it in. So you can see I already made a mistake, so I didn't enter the command before changing the ID to shard 3. Okay, so now I'm going to enter. You can see the response was okay, and I can check the status. And there is, I think there should be 2 secondaries. There are 2 secondaries. If I run it again, there is now a primary and a secondary. So you can see at this point, my shard servers have already been set up. Okay, so the next step is you need to set up the actual sharding on Mongos.